Hi everyone, and apologies for the confusion recent events have caused with the readings of Module 2. I hope that not too many of you were inconvenienced too much. You sort of have a broader knowledge base now, so I guess that's the silver lining in this little cloud. The upside for me is that I have a chance in this short video to talk about something that's been a big part of my life for many years, research with Indigenous peoples. I did my master's thesis based on my teaching time, at least related to my teaching time, working in a First Nations community not too far from my home in London, Ontario. And over the years, I've been asked to do some consulting with some of the boards around that area, and have worked with them and with another colleague, Rebecca Coulter, who has also done a lot of work with Indigenous people. And as a result of that, a whole master's program developed for leadership in First Nations communities at the request of the community. And some really great things will come out of that. So over the years, this has been a really important and just a very fulfilling part of my life. So I'm glad to have a chance to do this, and glad that we found the missing article that actually I was hoping that we would be able to include in the course, and thought that we had somehow taken it out. So anyway, that's all the background. So let's look at some of what the authors have to say. First of all, in order to explore this very important topic, I want to introduce you to the authors. First of all is Julie Bull, who is the author and presenter of the video that has been assigned to look at the possibilities and ethical complexities of working with Indigenous communities. By that, I mean, and I think she means too, communities that are reserve-based and urban-based. For example, in education, where many Indigenous children are educated actually in the provincial system, we could be talking about research with schools in Indigenous communities, as well as Indigenous students attending schools off reserve, from nursery school right through to post-secondary. Julie Bull is Inuk and a powerhouse. When you watch her video, you'll see what I mean, who works with government agencies and in academia based at the University of Toronto. Her primary interest is in the ethics of doing research with Indigenous peoples. And she's a real expert in this area, in ethics in general, but in terms of research, but especially this area. Her video is a masterclass in the history and policy background of ethical positions in relation to Indigenous peoples in general, and as well as researching with Indigenous peoples. Well worth watching closely. It's really excellent. And then the article that you'll be reading is by Alison Brophy and Helen Raptis, who are both non-Indigenous, and you'll understand where they're coming from when you read the paper, based at the University of Victoria. But they're both interested in working cross-culturally to support students from JKK to adult learners from all cultural backgrounds, but with a particular interest in Indigenous learners. And at University of Victoria, there's a real growth in some really excellent work being done around all kinds of Indigenous issues, including a special part of the faculty at the Faculty of Law. So there's a lot of good things going on, and they've been part of that whole conversation between non-Indigenous and Indigenous scholars who are coming together to build this whole arena of exploration. In this paper, they take on the necessary characteristics and ethical positions that are necessary for non-Indigenous researchers to research sustainably, and in a way that breaks down colonizing patterns of interaction between cultural groups. And you may be kind of perplexed about why they would take this on. But the reality is that while we have a really wonderful growing body of Indigenous scholars, and they are the first people that we need to go to, we also have a group of people who are working with Indigenous communities and are, as a result, conducting research with those communities. And these two women do exactly that. These two professors do exactly that. So they've done some exploration around this, because there's been almost no work in this area, and there still isn't. So this piece of work is helpful for those the students who are part of this program who may be interested in looking at questions around Indigenous education, but are not Indigenous themselves. And I think it really does a fine job of laying out what are some of the things that we need to be aware of. So what are the issues that all of this is trying to address? Well, there's a history of negative effects of research in Indigenous communities over many, many years. And I've heard just hair-raising stories of researchers coming in, finding out all about the land, taking that knowledge back to their universities, getting published all over the world, traveling around with their expertise in Indigenous geography or oil-based exploration or whatever it happens to be, and they exploit that group without ever taking anything back to that community. In fact, often taking from the community. So they're often taking information from the community, artifacts from the community for their own use, whether it's just simply, moving their academic career forward, or in actual fact, in a monetary way. And they're not thinking at all of the benefit to the community. And this has resulted in a huge breakdown of trust. So many Indigenous communities are very reluctant to do any kind of research with any scholars and others who do various kinds of research. And so there's a need for this conversation so that research can be done that is going to be beneficial to Indigenous communities. Brophy and Raptis argue that the research that we do needs to be decolonizing. Essentially, the kinds of relationships with Indigenous communities that result in the research issues we've just discussed actually come out of a history of colonialism and its effects in current relationships between the dominant culture, or the more powerful culture, and Indigenous peoples. Bindra and Kalu describe decolonizing research as work that deconstructs all the ways in which the privileges and desires of the dominant society, that is non-Indigenous, are embedded in its legal, government, and everyday relations of powers in schools, communities, health provision, access to the social benefits that are more readily available to non-Indigenous people. And there's plenty of statistical evidence of that fact, as well as qualitative evidence of that fact. So they argue that we need to be thinking, if we're going to be doing this kind of research, we need to be thinking about deconstructing these destructive patterns and moving towards things that are going to be empowering and beneficial. So all of the authors argue that decolonizing research is carried out by those with particular values, ethics, morals that are necessary to ensure sustainable research with Indigenous communities and urban Indigenous populations. As educators, we are challenged then to reflect carefully on the moral components we bring to our research with Indigenous peoples. Brophy and Raptis explore the literature and draw on several Indigenous scholars, including some from U of A, who outline those ethical characteristics. First is responsibility and trust. That is, the researcher will keep information confidential and will be accountable to the community with the information that they've gained. Next is humility. That is, respectful, willing to place the needs of the community above their own, and does not rush to judgment when actions are different than their own values would generally support. Rather, to accept these actions as fulfilling the needs and values of the community and to learn from those differences. A broad worldview helps the researcher to understand that there are many ways of being in the world. And reciprocity is key in light of the terrible history of many researchers in the past. Instead, research interests must benefit both the researcher and the community. Relational accountability is another key value in which reciprocity, trust, and respect come together in the sense that we are all connected to all things, animate and inanimate, and therefore there is a moral responsibility to ensure that no harm comes to the community, and all of this requires deep listening within relationship. And last, from what they discuss, although they go on to talk about some personal characteristics in this article, but in terms of these characteristics that a researcher needs to bring to sustainable research, they talk about self-identity. That is, an awareness of oneself, knowledge of who one is, and why the research is being done. And this has direct implications for the research methodology and how that is negotiated with the community in their interest. That is, that awareness of oneself is recognizing the privilege that we often carry with us and often don't recognize or pay attention to, but is obvious when we work in these cross-cultural contexts. Julie Bull provides a briefer version that encapsulates the Brophy and Raptis paper when she lists the following as essential to ethical research in Indigenous communities. First, it's all R, so it's easy to remember. First one is respect, and we can see respect being taken up in several of the one characteristics in the other list. The second is relevance, relevant to the Aboriginal community. Reciprocity, and again, we've talked about that. In fact, it's on both lists, where we give to the community, we don't take from the community, that we are both benefiting from this experience in multiple ways. Responsibility, responsibility to oneself, responsibility to the community that you're working with, responsibility with the results of the research that you've conducted, etc. And last, and probably most important, that phrase that we hear often when we talk about Indigenous peoples is all my relations. It's the relationship that we build, that our research needs to come out of relationship that is built before, during, and continues after the research takes place. That this is something that we're building together that will remain, and that I know if I've gone into a community to work with that community at their request, that we develop that based on a relationship and an understanding premised on that relationship. And that if they need something or I need something, we can talk to one another because we have that relationship. And that's what's required for really ethical research in Indigenous communities. So I hope this has helped. And if you have any questions about this, certainly I'd be more than happy to answer. There's so much more that we could talk about. But when you read this paper and watch the video, you're going to learn a great deal that will be really helpful to you, whether you're doing work with Indigenous communities or not. You can bring this to your relationships with the community as a teacher within in a community where Indigenous students are being served, for example. So these are transferable to other contexts as well. So I urge you to really pay attention and learn and listen and enjoy these papers and this video. Take care.